So I would like to introduce our next guest speaker, Jaan, founder and CEO of One Fact Foundation, and on the topic, the hidden curriculum of coolness and suffering. As you can see, Jaan's tall, white, shy kid, because he was usually the tallest in his grade, he stood out. This served as a kind of exposure to having a lot of attention in dealing with the ensuing discomfort. To cope, he learned to self-deprecate and worked hard to try to earn the trust people seemed to place in him. This led him to studying math and physics as a way of gaining career capital and creating optionality while avoiding the decision of what to do. Next, he further increased optionality and procrastinated by focusing his grad school studies on artificial intelligence and machine learning. During grad school, he saw what it was like to work at Google and DeepMind building AI and learned about corporate incentives and the risk of feeling forced to optimize for high salaries. After his graduate training, he decided to avoid working in industry to gain further leverage in the area of healthcare and in hope of seeking AI creating practical impact in lieu of abstract existential risk and angst. But he didn't like working in hospital because how political it was. So he started a nonprofit where is now learning to fundraise and deploy AI where it might actually improve health instead of revenue. He supports the sauna, improv, and other tools that should be accessible to anyone to help engender psychological safety and creative exploration at scale. So everybody, welcome Jaan.
Thanks so much for being down to listen to me for a bit. Just as a time check, it's like 40 minutes. Awesome. To start off, let's do a little exercise. It'll be maybe 1 or 2 minutes. It'll feel probably weird if you haven't done this, but I'll demonstrate. I have one of the chairs most of you are sitting on, so open up your diaphragm, put one foot in front of the other. Otherwise your diaphragm will be a little stuck. Put one hand here. If you want to, feel free to close your eyes. And then just notice your heart rate and see if you can pay attention to your heart rate. Hopefully you still have a heart rate. If not, please let us know ASAP. And this is something your Apple Watch can do too for like $800, $900. And so the next thing your Apple Watch can do that you can also learn is to notice your heart rate vary. It's called heart rate variability. And you can actually accentuate how much your heart varies. And to do that, then while you're noticing your heartbeat, maybe faster, maybe slower, maybe it's anxiety-inducing because you're noticing it. And so to actually accentuate your heart rate variability, then there's a specific breathing pattern that can help. And that breathing pattern is 4 or 5 seconds inhale through the nose and 4 or 5 seconds exhale through the mouth. So you can actually hear it. You should be able to hear people around you. And so I'll try it. I'll go first. And if you want to notice how your diaphragm moves in response to this pattern of breathing, feel free to put your other hand on your belly. So then as you're breathing in through your nose, 4 or 5 seconds, you might be able to feel your belly start to expand. And then as you breathe out, feel your belly pull back towards your spine. And so that's the basic movement. It might not feel basic at first. It might be your first time trying something like this to actually notice how fast your heart is beating, whether it's going faster or slower. And so this is probably the very uncomfortable part, especially if it's your first time, where you just do this for 20, 30 seconds. And see if you can notice a detectable difference in how fast your heart is beating. If it's going faster, or if it's going slower, and then when that to be happening. And feel free to raise your hand if you can notice a difference in how fast your heart is beating. And if it's going faster, if it's going slower, or just any detectable difference. And if you can't, totally cool, because that's a lot of proprioception or awareness of body, and try it on your own time. So I see a few hands up. If you noticed the difference, then when was that difference happening?
Between the inhale and exhale.
And what was happening?
The inhale is a little slower and the exhale is a little faster.
Yeah, so that usually happens. And now if you have an Apple Watch or you've seen one, then now you've replicated what the Apple Watch does essentially. Where if you put it on the breathing app, then it'll show you a circle moving bigger as your heart rate slows. And then it'll contract the circle as your heart rate speeds up as you exhale. And then you can synchronize your breathing pattern with that. And so that was maybe a few minutes. And hopefully it feels pretty simple. I'm glad a few of us felt it. And it just takes a bit of practice to get used to. And now you've saved yourself a couple $100 if your goal is to use technology to improve your life and optimize health or optimize HRV or whatever I've done for tens of thousands of hours of my life, because I listen to a lot of podcasts, Tim Ferriss or Andrew Huberman, and do the sauna and do cold plunges and try all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's actually very simple to pay a little bit of attention, maybe learn a bit of the neuroscience of like, why does it get faster as I exhale? That's actually because the amount of pressure is more on your heart, and your heart has less space physically, because your organs are pressing up against it. And there's a sinoatrial node in your heart, and that sinoatrial node is connected to your brain with a couple of neurons, and that's your autonomous nervous system, so it's independent of conscious effort. And that autonomous nervous system, the only goal of those two neurons are to regulate your heart rate. So by creating space, like literal space, more space for your heart can expand when your organs aren't up against it. When you've finished your inhale, your heart has more space, and so it's a little bit bigger. And because it's a little bit bigger, the electricity takes a little bit longer to go around. And you can see this on the electrocardiogram. That's how the Apple Watch works. There's an electrocardiogram that measures the amount of milliseconds that your heart takes to beat. And then based on that difference in how much time electricity takes to go around your heart, then it's a simple circuit. Your heart rate will slow down and will speed up in response to a little bit of a difference that you can control to some degree. Because it's stressful, we're in public or semi-public space, and so then you have all your social proprioception as well, you're around people. And so just getting to notice that effect, it's kind of cool that a few people noticed it. I was maybe on the edge of noticing it. But that's for me like a starting point for thinking about impact. Because it's simple math, it's a simple circuit, we all have it, we do it, I don't know, 1 million times a day, and many billions of times in our lifetime where we breathe, and then our heart rate slows or accelerates, just by a tiny little amount. And so that's one example of something I like to think about when I think about impact and labs, which is the name of this, and we're at a summit. And I like doing things myself, so then I can have a hope of maybe understanding a little bit better, like what I'm paying $800 for, if I'm like spending all this money on tools and optimizing and trying to improve my life, and then maybe other people's lives. As just what are very easy to understand, accessible examples, and is it possible to understand the simple principles behind those? In this case, from like physiology or intrathoracic pressure. That's the medical jargon for that term of your heart having a little bit more space and slowing down your heart rate in response to breathing. So that was a starting point for me of just thinking about, like, it's kind of cool that there's the Apple Watch. It's kind of cool we can pay a lot of money, and what are the incentives Apple has to live rent-free inside my brain and charge me all this money to optimize my life further, and then believe that, oh, something's wrong with me, I'm not meditating correctly, I'm using Headspace every day, or I'm using all the meditation apps. Like, I've tried all this stuff and I still do it, it's kind of fun. But I think just noticing the perception of, like, oh, this is really cool, there's a company and I can transact, and then it'll lead to an impact. In exchange for exchanging money, then I'll own a device, and then I'll get some benefit. And so it took me probably 10 years from, like, going hard on that type of lifestyle of, like, sauna, cold plunge, all the devices, typical tech bro attitude, meditating really intensely, to slowly start to realize that, hey, I can actually pump the brakes and be like, why does everyone think this is cool? And why do I invest so much time and effort and money and science and doing a PhD and doing everything just to extract a little bit more value from what I already have, which is a hand. If I'm lucky to have two hands, I'm able-bodied, so I can feel my heart rate and maybe understand a little bit that, all right, here's what's going on. It doesn't take much. So if you take away nothing else from what I'm sharing, then hopefully that's an experiential example that you can hold on to and remember, where if people are selling you stuff, if you're selling yourself stuff, like I sell myself on the idea of meditation or whatever it might be I believe is going to lead to a large impact, then it's okay to stop, just take a deep breath and be like, holy shit, my heart just slowed a little bit. And that creation of space, I think, is under our control. That's a little bit of an impact that is actually under our control. Whether you're treating it as a lab, or whether you're treating it as a product, or whether you're treating it as something to optimize, then it's something that I keep with me to make sure that whenever I need to, I can take a bit of a break and be like, wait, there's a lot going on here. I'm being sold on some idea, or I'm attaching myself very tightly. Anyone have any questions? Cool. So the title of this was The Hidden Curriculum of Coolness and Suffering. Hopefully you just experienced a little bit of both. Just seeing what that's like. And there's a lot that's hidden there, from like the medical terminology of intrathoracic pressure through to the circuits and through to the single lead EKG on an Apple Watch, through to Apple marketing campaigns, through to whatever might be living rent-free in your head, like it does in mine. I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing this well enough, or I haven't optimized for impact, or I haven't gone to the lab for enough hours as a grad student, or I haven't understood this fully, and I need to do this further. So that's one experiential example, and for the rest of this, like I put this online, so if you go to jaan.io/impact, you'll be able to see just my notes, what I tried to optimize for to maybe have a little bit of an impact, like first on myself, and then maybe on y'all, but these are just loose threads that I think about most days of just, if I start from myself, what's my impact there? I might have strong ties with people, family, friends, a work team, and then there might be a looser or broader organization there. Or if I'm going from myself to the internet, then there might be hundreds or millions or billions of people that just have access to whatever it is that's going on at like a personal level or interpersonal level or organizational level or societal level. And I want to also highlight like the N=1 experience that some of y'all just had of just like starting from very fundamental limits of, in this case, like physical limits, seeing that it is possible to reason from first principles of like, here's your heart rate, here's how much space your heart has. That millisecond difference in an EKG does lead to a perceptual cognitive change. And we all have cognitive limits. Phone numbers are 7 digits long for a reason. We can have about that amount in working memory. So when I'm zooming around, I'm like, hey, like maybe 7 things about on the page, not too much, to not overwhelm myself and then you. So respecting those limits, but also pushing those limits in a safe way, maybe with some principles, maybe with some shortcuts. I think that's how I've approached this question of like, how do you laboratize impact? And how do you trust that impact first in yourself, then those who might be lucky to be around you, who you might be lucky to be around and impact. And like, as you go further there from like you to people around you to broader society, like the amount of information you can hold in your brain is highly limited. So then your impact or your amount of trust in that impact should actually decrease. Just like you saw, like if like I bought into the idea of an Apple Watch and I optimized my heart rate variability for years, then that's many layers removed from myself, from just having fingers and paying attention a little bit, which I had to do a bunch of therapy to realize, and then talk to some doctors and understand something very simple and make that impact like more legible to me. And I think tying some of these principles to experiences that we all might have shared can also help, and also humor and play and fun, which is another good starting point for me of just thinking through like, I ended up this year like getting in big trouble at the Park Slope Food Co-op because I wanted to have an impact and I wanted to make a map. And the way this came about was that I read this book by Ben Lerner. It's called 1004. It's just about life in New York. And I won the housing lottery and moved to Brooklyn. I was really stoked to share it with my fiance, Yuli. And I was reading to her this chapter in this book about how political and hierarchical the Park Slope Food Co-op is. And then I was like, holy shit, I need to find out. I need to join it. So I joined the Park Slope Food Co-op, and then sure enough, I got an email saying like, hey, like, I know you want to give us our LinkedIn profile because it wasn't claimed. I claimed it. And then they didn't understand that. They thought I had created one. So there's, again, all these different levels of thinking about that, where if it's community masquerading as a bureaucracy or vice versa, a bureaucracy masquerading as community, just like you can put your hand on your neck and sense a difference, then it's possible to do that to some degree in safe ways, in very low stakes ways, like at a grocery store, by trusting your experience in a way. And this map came about in a similar way. I'll see if I can, pull this up. So this was just realizing that there's 17,000 members at the Park Slope Food Co-op, and there hasn't been a working or usable map. And one of my friends joined 2 months ago after I was part of the dispute resolution committee, case number, whatever. And my friend was like, hey, there's no map. And I was like, well, I have a solution. I made a map. But boy, did I get in trouble for making that map and trying to, again, like, trust my experience to be like, hey, like, I'm really confused. There's 17,000 members here and there's no map. Like, we can't figure out, like, where there's, like, fruits or where there's a bathroom, or if you're disabled, like, is there any hope for wayfinding? Or if there's trash in the back, then where is that? And the amount of trouble I got in was massive, where they made me sign my soon-to-be real name, saying that I shall not document with light imaging or laser imaging distance and ranging technology that we all have on our iPhones, if you have an iPhone, which is how you get one of these to write these maybe 30, 40 emails. And it's a very accessible thing that you rarely get the benefit or the privilege to actually hear a response from. But it's like, oh, you had a bit of an impact. And I'm like, wow, like, thanks for telling me. That's one of the best things I could hope for, because going back to that, like, first it's you, then a little bit of an outer shell, like your strong ties, and then weaker ties, to actually get feedback from the world that you trust, where it's like, oh, there was an impact here. It's really lucky, I think, because again, the further out you go, the more your trust should decrease rather than increase, because the more there's asymmetric information built into every stage of distance between you and another human. And so that was another story that came to mind, or this screenshot with another friend that I've known since high school and mentored and helped through all kinds of things, whether it's being forced into involuntary commitment by a college when they admitted to self-harm. And then it's a similar thing, which is like, here's a school counselor and they're not paid by you. You can change that if you were lucky to have insurance, but if you're out of school, they're protecting liability. If you're a risk to PR, if you're a risk optically, then you might be forced to take medical leave if you admit to being a risk to yourself, because that's a proxy for operational and optics risk for an institution that needs to protect its endowment and its returns. And so this is, again, like 5 or 6 or 7 years later, like, person's doing well and close friend now, but starting from a very similar, like, vulnerable stage of life, which is like high school, college, what do you do? How do you have an impact? And this is maybe like the 3 or 4 examples where I'm like, oh, maybe I actually had a slight impact on something or someone, and that's already like really, really lucky, I think. And so that's, I need to like work hard to remind myself of that fact, and also how accessible it is. Because we can all email somebody when they ask for help, or we can all be like, hey, is there a map here? Or can I feel my pulse? if we need to. And oh boy, like, maybe there's a question of technology. Like, y'all also might be fans of like scale. Like, I'm addicted to this thinking of scale. Like, here's the internet, here's billions of people that I can impact and crush with the AI that I build after doing my PhD and seeing how Google scales impact and makes information accessible. And that type of thinking is very, very addictive, because it creates a sense of control. I think when we can quantify something, and I can look at my website analytics, and I can be like, all right, I got 900,000 page views over a decade. Amazing impact. But how many of those people emailed me? People spent like 11 minutes on average reading something I wrote. But how many people emailed me? Maybe like 10 people. So then those 10 people, like, maybe I'm like, yeah, maybe it was helpful a little bit. Other than that, it's just numbers. And those numbers are such a poor, like, shitty representation of human experience and impact, which is like, maybe I think about this like once a year. I'm like, oh wow, that's kind of cool. I wrote some articles and tried to explain something clearly and people read it. But when I think of impact, like, things like this are much closer to like something I would actually trust, rather than like analytics going up or optimization criteria going up or AI metrics being optimized, or some kind of social impact that is highly addictive to try to quantify and then optimize and then tell people about and then market and then up the analytics. Like, that's most of my life now. That's like, as a nonprofit, it's like, what's your impact? How do you make it go up, and how do you tell people about it? How do you market? How do you do sales? And that's I think close to the heart of the message for me, of just thinking through in your life, like, what is closer to hand on your neck and breathing, and oh, maybe there's a chance to understand something a little bit about yourself and create a little bit of space if you're thinking about impact, or like, yeah, hopefully you're not turning it into a lab like I have for many years, and being like, oh, I can actually optimize this thing, and I can like try to get more text messages like this or more emails from high schoolers, and then be like, get them into school, get them into grad school, get them out of involuntary commitment, or do this or do that. That feels less aligned with these very loose values of whether it's agency or psychological safety or just noticing the stimuli we're conditioned with, the responses that are elicited from verbal events that we all share. And just, you tell a dog sit, it'll sit. You can condition that behavior by giving it a treat. And words serve that same purpose in our brain and behavior. So those are, like, first from the personal n=1 level, just understanding the impact that is accessible to all of us. At a physiological level, you feel your heart rate slow if your heart has a little bit more space. Organizationally or community-wise, whether it's like unfortunate therapist at a school forcing you to go to involuntary commitment or forced medical leave if you admit to needing a lot more help than others might. Or if it's you're dealing with sex abuse and then needing to understand the law. Those are very different levels of scale, but all things that we will unfortunately all experience and all forced to be surrounded with, whether it's visible or hidden, and regardless of whether you think it's cool. Because there's many, many things tied up there, which is like, why did I get rejected from like every US school I applied to for college, and then optimize the hell out of undergrad, copy assignments, and then do my best to get into the US for grad school? There's many layers of impact there, which is like, did I have a chip on my shoulder? Probably. Did I love the US? For sure. And things like that, I think, are experiences that are unfortunately part of our lives now, of just optimizing for something, whether it's SATs, GREs, or PSATs, or whatever the level might be. Like, I was mentoring a kid from Queens for the past few years, and they're stressed about high school admissions. And they're stressed about impact of their test scores. And I'm like, oh my God, this is a lot of suffering to foist onto somebody without the benefits that hopefully more people can experience of like, there's ways to put your hand here and just create a little bit of space. Or organizationally, there are ways to look at it as a lab or distance yourself cognitively a little bit from that very emotional response that tends to be common in these situations. There's, a few different stories here in terms of the useful skills or like practical takeaways. Then I think just there's some level of optimization that has really helped me, whether it's like emailing Malcolm Gladwell and then him responding, and then helping launch this like non-profit science website idea I had. It sounds great, but then I remind myself like, hey, I had to send out 200 of those emails and most of them did not get any replies except for his. So that's back to this tension between like, there's you, and then there's this abstract notion of impact. And there is this kind of coin flipping, statistical, probabilistic aspect to life, where you can do your best, like n=1, but then to broaden that impact by a little bit, I had to send hundreds of emails. And I had to do the same thing to get into Princeton, which is, I emailed in college, I was like, hey, I'm studying math and physics, I want to do grad school. And thankfully, Shivaji replied and ended up being my advisor a few years later, but I don't think he knows that I had to send the same email to, again, like hundreds of people to get one response. And I feel really, really lucky to have, like, say, had a dad who was a professor and then, like, coached me on, like, writing cold emails or writing papers or doing this. Like, I already feel like I'm lucky to be in, like, the very top percentile of having all of this like legacy in a way. And so the least I could do is like, if I get one of those emails, I'm like, hey, like, sure, I'll spend like 20 hours of my life and like maybe answer some questions for a high school student. And that's like already doing a lot, because I'm like, I don't think I'll ever expect more than that, of just getting that email a few years later being like, hey, look, you had some influence. And I'm like, wow, I had some influence? Holy shit. So hopefully some of these stories help. Claude and the other large language models tried to summarize this talk better than I could. Hopefully you're also seeing like this idea of like limits come through, whether that's like emotional limits or societal limits, organizational limits, working memory limits, physiological limits come through, and then just dancing on the edge of those limits or finding safe ways to be like, what's socially acceptable or what's legally acceptable, what's financially acceptable. And while I've been very lucky, I've also had some misfortune. Like I didn't have a green card until January this year and had to go into credit card debt to cover it. And then I was thinking through that, I was like, well, I could understand the law again and look at Chapter 7 bankruptcy, Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Or I could call the creditors and be like, hey, I have 30K, like, do you mind if I decrease that number and just give you a lump sum? Because I'm thinking of incentives. Like, they know that it's either bankruptcy or they make me pay. And then sure enough, I got a letter a few weeks ago saying like, you have 30K on your balance sheet that you can pay us 8K or 2 payments of 5K. And then you're good. So that's a very long-term, not that, but very long-term like reasoning through principles, similar to putting your hand here, being like, oh, why does my heart rate slow when I breathe in? It's like, oh, what's the credit card company, Chase in this case, incentivized to do? They better cut me a deal because they know what's coming. And that takes that kind of like laddering up of like thinking through like, what's a silly use case of this kind of stance? Maybe it's like making a map of a grocery store. But when you run into like very real limits, whether that's immigration and needing to pay for the green card lawyer like I had to, needing to rely on credit, that's where I think all that practice pays off, of just like, I feel lucky that I understand the law to that extent, or I understand the financial system, or I understand AI, or I understand credit risk algorithms at some level of detail to be able to make that experience very concrete and practical rather than very abstract. And that locus of control, or that sense of like, hey, I'm the one deciding to put my hand here. I'm the one deciding to modulate my breath in response to instructions. That so easily dissipates when we're the ones who bear the material consequence of like immigration or whatever things might be going on societally. And in terms of the biggest impact, that's, I think, Yuli. That's my fiance who I met last year. And I needed so much help and years of trust to be able to propose to her the day that I met her, because I was like, I'm gonna need to keep up with her my whole life. And that relied on so many years of being like, hey, what do I put on my bios, on Hinge, on Bumble, or whatever? How do I optimize the algorithm? How do I find someone that I need to keep up with? How do I demonstrate social proof, or whatever people optimize for? How do I put the right things into the algorithm? But then end up meeting her at a friend's wedding. And then similarly, like the incentives there are vastly, vastly different. I think I have dating as an example here, which is like, you either meet somebody through a dating app or you meet a person. And if they're on a dating app, that dating app is usually backed by venture capital or owned by the same conglomerate, and they have an incentive to keep you coming back, but after enough time. So then the matches you get are just below a threshold where you come back and pay a monthly membership fee to make some key performance indicators or valuations or next 12-month revenue sufficiently stable. So then the app has enough cash to keep marketing and keep growing. So that was another example that came to mind of, I think, of like the biggest impact that I've experienced in the past year of like meeting Yuli, but then that very long-term bet of like, hey, I better delete these dating apps and just trust that I will meet somebody, because the incentives are extremely misaligned from just meeting a human instead of meeting an algorithm, an algorithmically mediated interaction backed by inpatient venture capital. And that was another, yeah, I think we're almost out of time here. So to wrap up, I think I added all the references, notes, reading lists that I needed to get here, or whatever like weird ideas I might have about impact. And they're up here. Feel free to go there, check it out, and send me an email. And if you want to know the kinds of impacts I'm pursuing now, I also added a link to what we're working on at OneFact, whether that's looking at the incentives that hospitals have to charge crazy amounts for C-sections in the Bronx or in Manhattan, and then how we're using algorithms to reduce the price of healthcare, or whether it's diagnosing x-rays and fractured bones of kids with AI. These are hopefully tangible impacts and a little bit closer to this vision of the world of just, you can experience it, and you can either go to a hospital and get charged 90K or go to another hospital and get charged 40K if a C-section is part of your birth plan. But that's the most concrete I've been able to make it so far, of like turning impact into a lab and then trusting bits and pieces of my own experience and using technology to mediate scale. So hit me up anytime. I'm happy to help. And if you need practice cold emailing, then my email's there. So thank you so much. I was taking questions at the time. Yeah.
Great talk, thank you. I loved it. So in terms of something like a small thing, like for you doing that map with the scanner on your phone, or like, just to give some hypothetical examples, things as small as like maybe like telling someone their shoes untied, or like
I love that one.
thank you. Or like maybe you see that there's no like user interface for a certain thing that usually requires people to have expertise in coding, so you set it up so more people can have access to it.
Or MTA questionnaires. I love filling out the MTA questionnaire.
So basically, I was gonna ask you. Those were like only a few I could think of, because I like this kind of stuff too, like the little quirky things and get obsessive about it, kind of. I'm not saying you get obsessive about it, I get obsessive about it.
I do.
But basically, like several parts of this question. One, what are some more ways we can get more people to feel comfortable doing that kind of thing and not feeling like, what are you doing? Like, that's so weird, just focus on this mainstream stuff. Why don't you just become, I don't know, a lawyer, a doctor, focus on the path. You don't need to like make a map, for example. So how can we get more people doing this kind of random thing that helps people? Two, are there any more like specific things you have in mind that you could give as ideas of this kind of thing? And I guess three, like, what are your thoughts on this kind of thing? Can you have like something where like each person does a very small thing and can have a very big impact? Or does it make more sense to focus on bigger initiatives? So that's a lot, but feel free to answer whatever.
I really appreciate the question, and I do think about this all the time, and part of the reason I tried to find like the simplest words I could for a domain name, like OneFact, that is like all it takes to create change, and that's the nonprofit we're working on, or Pay Less Health. That's like legible, human understandable. But then I started thinking of like, well, what kind of things do we need everybody involved with this organization to understand? And the first page of our employee handbook as a draft is here. And this is the like biggest impact thing that I know how to communicate, which is a mix of two skills called motivational interviewing and active listening, where it sounds very simple, and it is. It's common skills that therapists might use, support autonomy, express empathy, helping somebody make sense of messiness and presenting a black and white picture to them in communication while paying attention to their nonverbal behavior, their verbal behavior, and trying to do that in a transparent way. That's something that, like, boy, did I need to learn these skills through many years of like therapy, and then being like, oh, my therapist is doing like not really like telling me much of what to do. They're just like asking questions that are being like, do you want to go this way or do you want to go that way? And these are extremely accessible skills. And I tie it back to mental health in a way because it's one of the most approachable things that we're all faced with. Even if it's 5 seconds talking to somebody on the street, there's still something like, oh, like, are you gonna untie your shoe or tie your shoe? Or if you have 30 seconds, are you gonna fill it the subway thing or not? Or can you, for yourself first, and then for maybe another human, if you're lucky to interface with another human, then can you provide a little bit of space, whether it's listening to them or giving them undivided attention, asking open-ended questions, conveying things. These are all as simple as they sound. And I think they're also the most accessible thing. And you can literally tell ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your favorite local LLM is to say like, hey, like give me 10 different ways to practice motivational interviewing or active listening. And this is used by, say, like the Obama campaign. This is used in sales, in hostage negotiation, in therapy, and across a very broad set of things, the same few principles, which is ask questions, tell somebody what your intent is, and if you're lucky to, maybe help them identify a tiny little change or feeling of stuckness, or like, hey, like, do you want to feel something cool? Put your hand here. Like, it doesn't have to be big. I think that's kind of my goal in like starting this organization, is just like conveying that it can start from one fact, whether it's intrathoracic pressure or the price of C-sections, or hey, AI works pretty well, it's just not evenly distributed to hospitals. So hopefully that's...
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was awesome.
Hello. I was just wondering, what were some other valuable lessons that you learned in therapy besides the breathing technique? I actually love therapy, and I also have a therapist. She's focused a lot on like guided meditation and like slowing down and being mindful of your surroundings and your body. So I just wanted to know your thoughts.
Probably like, in a weird way, like sales, because therapists are some of the best salespeople, because if you need to convince a depressed person or somebody who's trying to commit suicide every day to come back for just another visit, you better know how to live rent-free in somebody's head with principles of therapy, of just like all those things, like guided meditation or something, or if somebody's experiencing schizophrenia and in psychosis and resistant to medication, like, boy, you better know how to help that person feel safe. And then when they're really considering or they have a plan, then to at least give you a call and be like, hey, like, I'm about to do it, I have a plan. And then you as a therapist, you're thinking like, all right, this person's risk just went up like this. I'm glad they're at least giving me a call. And that's when you can move into a non-judgmental stance and be like, what else is new today? You've told me this for the past 10 weeks. And that kind of like cognitive decoupling in a way from like, oh, this person is making me feel safe and warm and cared for, and I'm also very aware of their limits, whether it's financial, like I can't afford to pay, or they can't afford to take my insurance anymore, or whether it's emotional, like, oh, they see hundreds of people, and I feel a personal connection, but I'm glad that they don't in a way, because then it depersonalizes it to a degree, and I can view it more as a service, instead of like, oh, I need to like ask them questions, or I need to care about their lives. So I think many of those skills, seeing like professionals model this and realize that, oh, they actually have training manuals that you can look up, or they have like ways of dealing with trauma, or they also need help. or humanizing the profession in a way, and being like, oh, if I was a therapist, of course I would need to maybe take like Medicaid a little bit of the time, but then focus on like private pay, and then I need to make revenue. I need to cover the cost of staff. I can only afford to take like 2 Medicaid patients a week. And so I've been on both ends of that, whether it's like in a hospital system, working at a hospital, but then as a patient, being on Medicaid as an immigrant, and needing to realize like these are hard limits. Like there's a waiting list like this if I have Medicaid, but if I work at a hospital, I have really good insurance, and then it's like this. But then I still might need to get like a single case agreement exception to afford $3.75 an hour care if I had PTSD last year and depression. So I think just understanding where those incentives come to a head, and especially in the case of like medication, like why is the prescription of antidepressants going up? Like it's a cost-effective way, as a psychiatrist, like I am worried about revenue, and it's 15 minutes, and then I need to help as many people as possible, and I need to think about finance. And I needed medication last year, and I was on like an antidepressant for about a year total, but it took me a long time to think about just that, which is like, what are the incentives system-wide, and how much can I trust these numbers? And oh boy, do I really need the help, because all my symptoms are very bad. So I think like learning to balance those different things in a very personal way, that's a lot of the like biggest benefits that I got. And then being like, oh wow, like now that I'm good, I still want to talk to this person, but there's not enough therapists in the world. It's a hard job, so I better quit. And oh wow, that's really hard to do. So I think just being forced to grapple with this in a very personal way.
Thank you for your answers.
Thank you for your talk. On the same line of thinking of like incentives, of like different companies' incentive, you also talk about misaligned incentives, especially in the case of dating apps versus like, love. But I'm wondering, like, I mean, we're living in a society where we work in institutions, we live in structures. There's many times perhaps we're in structures of misaligned incentives that we cannot get out of. Do you have suggestions or thoughts on these situations? I think many of us grapple with. That's just like, maybe we know our internal desires and needs, and maybe we can already deduct the incentives of these organizations, but maybe we still need to work around them when they're misaligned.
Yeah, I think it's a very hard question, and I think if I say anything other than like ask for help, then it would be putting a lot of undue burden. And I think these things are so complex, and remember, we can only have like 7 plus or minus 2 things in our working memory at a time. So especially if you're thinking of misaligned incentives and you're the one bearing the burden of feeling stuck or feeling like, oh, I'm subject to all this stuff, then like the top 1 or 2 shortcuts are just like, that I wrote down, are just like, one, like asking for help, even if it's just an email or just like a small, even one emoji to one person, and thinking like, if my brain is giving me this emotional response of feeling stuck, or if my behavior has led me to experience these misaligned incentives in such a tight, focused, stuck way, then I can do anything, and it would at least be a little bit different, and would give my brain, body, behavior, and eventually, hopefully, beliefs a different signal, which is like, I'm not alone, I at least sent one emoji today, or I at least expressed that there's something out there that is not this feeling of misalignment or whatever it might be. And often just the simple act of like being forced to write it down, even if it's an emoji or whatever it might be, or being forced to emit one signal to one other human, that's been enough in my experience to like create a little bit of space in a similar way, which is like, oh, if I'm just alone, then just like put it in there, take a deep breath, then that act of being forced to condense something into a symbol, whether it's silly like an emoji or just like one of these essays that I wrote to friends' kids when they were born, then like that act of like emitting a symbol and then attaching some aspect of her behavior or belief to it, not too seriously, but with enough seriousness to give it some gravitas or give it some intent, whether it's an emoji or just like, hey, it's kind of interesting to put something on letterhead, send it to a friend's kid because they have the least agency and they're coming into this world. Just an interesting experiment, and boy, do I need all this help myself. So that's what I really need to learn and still need to learn every day. Just like, it's really hard to feel entitled to ask. And as my friend Sarah Haggie says, she's a writer in Toronto, she says, Lord, grant me the confidence of a mediocre white male. I'm saying that as a mediocre white male, which is like, it's really hard to feel entitled to ask or admit that symbol or be like, hey, I'm deserving of this. Like, nobody's responding to me, and it's like everybody's experiencing this, so it's not exactly my fault. And that internal or external locus of control, which is like, do I blame myself? Do I apologize? Do I do this? Or do I find some signal to give to my body and brain and person and broader social organizational context, which is like, model the behavior I want to see. If I expect anyone else to tell me if they're feeling these misaligned incentives, why am I not telling anyone? I think that's why I think it's the starting point for me, which is like, it's a huge ask to like spend any cognitive effort on this when you're the one bearing a material consequence and you're already at capacity. Which is like, if you don't treat other people that way, why treat yourself that way? Why don't you just like send an emoji or do literally most things that is not just like thinking about it? Because thinking about it usually will just create the further belief or perpetuate the falsehood that like you can reason your way out of it, rather than you're just like in society, as you point out, and we're all subject to misaligned incentives. So hopefully that answers some of the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
So I wanted to ask about something that I related to in your presentation, and that was kind of that optimization and I guess trying hard. And so what I wanted to ask about is, I noticed that there were times where you recognized that this optimization wasn't necessarily healthy or the best thing for you, even though it was created to address a need. Let's go with the love, for example. You optimized it, humans deserve love, and so you created that, but then you were able to recognize that, wait a minute, this isn't the right way to go about it. But on the other hand, you optimized your Princeton, acceptance.
Cloud chasing.
You exactly, 200 emails, figuring out how to write cold emails, and I'm sure that tech bro background or period that you had where you kind of meditating and maybe journaling, whatever, did at least have some sort of benefit. So that also came from a need. I need to go to the US and whatnot. And so how do you know, is this optimization healthy? And even if it is unhealthy, it's getting me what I need, so should I not do it?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And that's I think just like the first few times you like try that and notice that, oh, my heart rate's going faster or slower, it's crazier, there's a lot of difficulty here, then it's a very foreign thing to like first notice that, oh, maybe this optimization isn't all I'm making it out to be, or my behavior isn't making it out to be, or society isn't maybe incentivizing me in the right way to like optimize so hard or try so hard. That's where I think some of these, like that's why I kind of phrased it in terms of principles and then shortcuts, where the things that are, I think of math a lot of just like what is orthogonal and what is like boredom feeling like, or what is the complete like 90-degree separation between like whatever feels like trying super hard or needing to do this or needing to have an impact or needing to like get through the next loophole that society's forcing me to climb through to even decide if I want to be there. And so I think that's the little bit of space for me, which is like finding things that, like therapy to some degree has been that, but has also been like, oh, I've needed to quit because I'm like, oh, this person doesn't understand the context sufficiently, or this therapist might not have the years of training required to deal with my complex PTSD. And then needing to quit and be like, all right, like, this therapy is incentivizing me to like continue thinking or continue journaling or continue optimizing. And that kind of like thinking at a higher level, that's the hardest part to catch myself on. And for me, it's less a question of like, oh, I did something wrong, I'm needing to catch myself. It's more like doing something completely unrelated. That's why like the emoji example comes to mind, or improv, or dance, or music, or public speaking, or like taking a bike ride and finding a place on satellite view that just looks cool. And that's like a really random activity that just doing something like that, like here's like going to the Bronx and finding like the edges of maps on these new e-bikes that they're testing out, or scooters in the Bronx. And like, I don't know why we did that, but it's very unrelated to anything that might feel like optimizing. And then finding things that feel that way, that it's like, that's a thing that takes practice to build up confidence in yourself for, I think, of just like, oh, I really trust that this feels like completely pointless or useless, or it's unrelated, like why am I doing this? But actually there's something kind of interesting here, different. And then the more I find a balance between like things that are just completely unrelated to stuff, then I would trust my belief a little bit more that, all right, I'm in a somewhat healthy place of like trying really hard or needing to jump through hoops in society or like go to grad school, and having enough space to like keep that light touch, or find those like really low stakes, silly ways to be like, it's just kind of interesting to like make a map of a place that seems really resistant to having a map. Or like those things where it's just like, why? It's like there's some weird need here, but it's really like a result of my experience and feeling like there's not that much point here, but that is kind of the point, because if I'm not doing enough of those things, then I really can't trust the rest of it in a way, or that sense of like needing to try. So hopefully that's somewhat clear. I'm happy to chat after.
Thank you so much, Jaan, for your talk, and we'll take a short break. Thank you for sharing.